I was arguing in the WTO, let's use poor Dunkel draft DDT and reform, which is what we did. You know, we are not one of those countries where consensus comes in. We are great reformers out of compulsion, not out of conviction. You had to ship gold in 91 before you started bringing down your tariffs. You look at the history of reforms in India, it is either terribly incremental or it will happen when you are completely broke and there is a crisis. Then it's like the marriage you perform for your daughter. Nothing is bloody done until the last minute, and then you're running around like a mad chicken, and then somehow everything gets done. That's how we are when it comes to reforms also. So I would make that point that perhaps the criteria we are using to evaluate FTA with ASEAN, but also with other FTAs, is unfair. If you are only going to say, I have to export more, obviously that's what the other side also wants to do. They're not idiots. And they're not going to let you do it, especially when you yourself accept that your domestic industry is not competitive. Then how do you do that? So my point is, if there can be, and I have been saying this to Professor Prabir Dey and others, he heads the ASEAN India Center here, as you know, can we find out whether we have benefited in terms of at least getting on to the value chains, whether our products are now conforming better to TBT, SPS? For me, these are very significant gains. Frankly, I don't care so much if, all the time we are going to be importing more than we export. That's okay. I can live with it if there are other concrete gains. That's what I would say. But
just a brief point, I don't think when you say that you should be exporting more, you automatically say that you should not be importing more either. That's not the corollary, please. What we say is that it depends on the nature of imports.
Yes.
What is it that you're importing?
Yes.
If those imports are in line with your value chain integration, it works. Otherwise, then, a surging deficit never works. So, these are basic economic points that we would all be aware of. But as I said, and as I quoted some of the figures, in the sense of sectoral stuff, as I said, I'm not sure as far as minute details in terms of firm level integration is concerned. But we don't see that kind of a value chain integration having happened so far. Even if we say and try and justify that imports have increased, so what? Export increase is not our objective. Export increase is always the objective, Imports increase happen, yes, but if that's in line with your export, feeding into your exports, value chain, etc., yes. The second point, I think I've had many negotiators. I made the same point, I think, about India-ASEAN earlier. I've made that in my writing several times, that India did this on account of geopolitics. I think we all understand that. But the outcomes to be reviewed should also be reviewed and should also be worked upon in terms of future as far as FTA design is concerned, or in terms of the next line of FTAs that we are negotiating is concerned, RCEP being one. That's my humble point, if you'll accept, please. Thank you.
No, that's a very good point. Jayant, by the way, I defended you in your absence. There was something said about negotiators in general, so... No, you did not. I know that. No, but coming back to FTA model, I completely agree. But Mr. Kher will come back towards the end. But if I heard him right, pharmaceuticals, textiles, automobiles, and maybe ICT, I think we will have to see. I'm not sure on what basis we are saying that. I've certainly made that point also, like you, that we are not very much part of the value chain. My point is, are we better off today than we were if we had not signed the FTA? That's the only question I'm asking. Whether the FTA has made any difference to India belonging to the value chain. But that's something, Mr. Kher, perhaps if you can. But Mr. Pranav Kumar, can I just provoke you also, since I at least believe in non-discrimination, MFN. I'm provoking everybody, so let me provoke you. The one criticism that was implicit, but I'm now making it explicit so that you can get it, is the industry is still used to, dealing with a protected market. I think there have been loads of time given to you. We got independence in 1947, 1990, we signed the Uruguay Round agreements, and then years and years have passed. But there still seems to be a tremendous reluctance. The reluctance of the industry to compete is an important factor for the points made by Dr. Amitabh Batra. Frankly, our own, opposition to FTAs is based on that. Number two, if I asked you to name one or two impediments that the industry, you have every right to say that the logistics is bad, the infrastructure is lousy, and that the government policy is lousy. You can say that. So, If I asked you to point out one or two serious impediments that the industry is facing, what would those be? But obviously you will make the remarks that you've already planned to make. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. And thanks, Praveer, for giving me this opportunity. It was indeed a very lively discussion and debate. And let me just pick up last point which you mentioned about the mindset exports are good, imports are bad. And before I begin my intervention on the points and questions which you have raised, that if you look at the China-Australia trade figure, China has a trade deficit of $55 billion with Australia. And what China is importing, it's raw materials and agriculture products, and that is feeding Chinese industry and manufacturing. So that's a good example to prove that imports are always good, are also good. It's not always bad. Having said that, let me also try to give another perspective about FTA. Normally, we tend to say that FTA is a free trade agreement, it gives you preferential market access, but I have a different take on that, because these days every country is signing a FTA with other countries. If you take the ASEAN, since we are discussing India, ASEAN, in ASEAN you signed free trade agreement in 2009. You're all competitors, China, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand. In any market you compete with 10, 20 countries, not more than that. All have the same market access, same level of market access. So by signing FTA, you are at the level playing field. In practical terms, it doesn't give you preferential market access. So that point has to be understood, because we unknowingly said that you have a preferential market access, why exports are not rising. So if you are at par with your competitors, and the competitors you can imagine, who are your competitors? China, Japan, Korea, very strong in manufacturing. And in comparison to them, we stand nowhere. Even today, after 4 years of Make in India and all the focus on manufacturing. So things boil down to the domestic enabling environment and the factors which again, you mentioned about the impediment, the trade logistics, infrastructure, cost of capital, host lot of issues which needs to be addressed to make you at par with your competitors particularly. And of course, the big giant, we all know that China, which is dominating this region. But on figure, I think that is beauty of statistics. Mr. Kher mentioned about that the trade has increased. Amita mentioned about that there has not been much difference. If you look at I tend to agree with that view, because if you look at the figure between 2009 and 10 and 2016-17, the export from India to ASEAN, it has increased from $18 billion to $30 billion, so it's an increase of $12 billion. And import from ASEAN into India is increased from $25 billion to $40 billion. So in terms of course, it has not been a very big and massive jump from both sides. But at least from ASEAN side, you can imagine, because in both the markets, we are competing with China in ASEAN market. ASEAN is also competing with China in Indian market. But at least ASEAN has more preference than us, because China has a preferential market access in ASEAN, and we are competing with China, but China doesn't have preferential market access in India. So more import could have happened from ASEAN side to India, which did not happen. Because if you look at because both are big market, India and ASEAN, and in 2009-10, before, at the time of the operationalization of free trade agreement, the trade deficit was 7 billion, now today it is 10 billion. So there has not been much difference in terms of we call about the trade deficit. So I tend to agree with that. Of course, there has not been very significant impact on two-way trade flow. So if at all we have to leverage and utilize FTAs, we have to do at least most of the work on the domestic enabling environment, which we did not do. And of course, your point on that we have been reactive. And if you look at the trade policy reform since the days of Uruguay round, or you can say 1991, the first major dose of reforms came in 1991 when we were back to the wall because of the Gulf crisis and all. The second major reforms happened on trade policy front in 1995 when we acceded to and signed the WTO agreement. The third instance was when we lost the case in WTO, then we dismantled the quantitative restrictions. And now, after this government came and we signed the trade facilitation agreement, then we set up a national NCTF action plan, and we mapped out all the logistics and trade logistic gap, and we are trying to address, because that's again to fulfill our obligation in WTO. So it's this last 20, 30 years, see that all the major steps on trade policy front we have taken have been very reactive.
Very reactionary.
Yeah, very reactionary. So that we need to address and see how we can be proactive. The kind of proactiveness we have shown in case of fiscal reforms or larger investment reforms and all. So that, in fact, Mr. Kher has also been emphasizing in most of our meetings also that trade policy has to be mainstreamed in the larger context of policy reforms. Much have been said about the global value chain. In fact, this is the topic which is most talked about but least understood, I would say, at least from industry point of view. And it's very complicated. In fact, since Mr. Kher was the Commerce Secretary, he encouraged several times, pushed us to at least sensitize industry, at least the big players who are decision makers can think about it. We tried from our end, but of course, we have not moved much further. But GVC is, of course, a very complicated exercise, and it has to be, in fact, still we are seeking his guidance how we can take this initiative forward, at least on a very minimal level, incremental basis. Because there are certain issues like basically infrastructure, and one more important issue is the standards particularly. And standards, again, thanks to Mr. Kher, that the whole debate and discourse on the standard started in the discussion because of his own initiative. So at present, we have formed a forum, I would say the platform where industry, all the standard setting agencies and Department of Commerce and other relevant ministries, they are discussing their standards. And we are really adopting a forward-looking approach on the standards, which is again a very important component when we talk about global value chain. Because in global value chain, you have a lead companies, sitting maybe Japan or Germany, wherever, they have their own set of standards. And most often, those standards are private in nature. So you are the standards takers, not the standard givers. So that is another important. Now, let me come to the services part. We all know that this is one important component of our FTA. In fact, in case of ASEAN, the situation is different. We first concluded a goods agreement, but later on, that is, services have been the major aggressive area of our interest in most of the FTAs. But the fundamental problem in services, again, I would say, if you look at our export basket of services, not diversified. Not in terms of product diversity, even market also. We are dependent on one product, IT-enabled services, and 2-3 major markets like USA and Europe. And similarly, when we talk about ASEAN, in fact, in all the discussion which have been happening in the Department of Commerce for the last 1 decade, I would say, most times the IT people come, other people have no clue how to access, whether it's chartered accountants or lawyers and other people, they have no clue how to, they are told that, look, we have negotiated a free trade agreement for you, you have a market access, but of course, frankly speaking, they have no clue. And if you talk about IT-enabled services, now they are facing the music and heat in these traditional big markets. But most of the times they were saying that we have still very niche market in Europe and America. So we don't need to bother much about ASEAN and this part of the world. So, and that is why we have seen. But if you look at the ASEAN market, and in the total import of ASEAN is $300 billion. It's a huge market, services. So we need to do something to occupy, and that's why we have to move beyond our traditional and well-defined approach. And I would agree with Mr. Kher mentioned about that we have overplayed the Mode 4 part. So that, again, in every country it is politicized, including a country like Singapore also. We have seen the recent restrictions that Singapore has brought in. So in this, if we are able to at least redefine and re-strategize our position, particularly in the context of Mode 2, and 3 sectors I would mention: education, health, and tourism. And here you have to address your own domestic, you have to strengthen your tourism sector in terms of infrastructure, law and order, and other things. Again, in education, huge private investments have gone into Indian education sector, but still the quality regulation is still lacking. Similarly, in health services, again, huge private investments have gone. But again, we are trying to attract more international patients, but at present, it's very coming, either Indian diaspora or from few selected countries is coming. So in these 3 sectors, at least we can do a lot to enhance our services export. On investment part, I would say that, and CLMB particularly, that also came up for discussion. If you look at the investment particularly in ASEAN market, between 2003 and 16, the ASEAN as a group attracted 1.2 trillion of investment. And 33% of that has gone to CLMV. And our share is minuscule in spite of so much focus from the government. Again, I would put the blame on industry. We have been trying to sensitize industry, encouraging industry to go for that, but that is still, we have a long way to go. So these are the points I had to...
Thank you. Can I just ask you one last question? Hypothetical scenario. Everybody in the region is signing FTAs, left, right, and center. Hypothetical question. You still think we would be better off not signing an FTA? You made a point earlier. I understood it to mean that when you say this is a preference which everybody else is getting, you are finally saying even that preference is useful for you, isn't it?
Yes, definitely. Because at least it brings you a level playing field.
Okay. I understand now. So Mr. Kher is going to have the last word, but I do want some questions from the audience. Yes, definitely. I think we will postpone the coffee by 10-15 minutes if that's okay with you. Instead of 3:15, is it okay, Mr. Prabir Dey?